The community hall was filled with warm lights, soft chatter, and the low hum of people greeting one another after a long week. It was one of those small-town events where everyone knew everyone, and people came mostly to see familiar faces, enjoy a cup of tea, and listen to a few local performers play music. At the front of the hall stood a shiny black piano on a small stage. It belonged to a respected group of musicians who performed at almost every event the town held. They took great pride in their instruments and rarely allowed anyone outside their group to touch them. Among the crowd stepped in a quiet girl, entering slowly and almost unnoticed. She looked younger than most of the people there, and her clothes were simple, nothing fancy, nothing that stood out. She held her hands close to her chest, as if she wasn't sure she belonged there. Her guardian, an older relative, had told her to wait inside while they stepped out for a few minutes to greet someone outside. The girl nodded and stayed near the back wall at first, not wanting to disturb anyone. The hall buzzed with laughter and conversations. People mingled near the snack tables, sipping tea and nibbling on small pastries. Children ran around the corner of the room chasing each other, and a few guests were already seated, waiting for the local performers to begin. The girl's eyes, however, stayed fixed on the piano. She had seen videos of pianos before, and she had listened to music many times, but standing in front of a real one felt almost unreal to her. The polished surface reflected the warm lights above, and the keys looked like a perfect line of black and white that held secrets she had always wanted to understand. She moved a little closer, taking careful steps. She didn't mean to draw attention, but curiosity pulled her in like a magnet. Some people noticed her walking toward the stage, but they didn't think much of it at first. To them, she looked like a shy kid simply wandering around. The musicians, however, who were gathered in one corner checking their sheet music, saw her too. One of them leaned toward the others and whispered, "Look at that. She's going near the piano." A couple of them chuckled lightly, not out of anger, but out of the belief that she had no idea what she was doing. They spoke softly, but their expressions said everything. They didn't think she belonged anywhere. Near that instrument, the girl didn't climb onto the stage right away. She stood in front of it for a moment, unsure if she should get closer. She looked around to see if anyone was watching, and when she noticed that most people seemed busy talking or laughing, she slowly stepped up, one foot at a time, onto the small platform where the piano stood. Some of the younger guests sitting nearby nudged each other and giggled. They didn't expect anything serious. They thought she would tap the keys randomly or maybe pretend she knew how to play. A few adults glanced over too, giving the kind of look people give when they think something small and silly is about to happen. The girl reached out her hand, stopping just before her fingers touched the keys. She breathed in softly. The air around her felt quiet even though the hall was filled with noise. She wasn't trying to show off or perform for anyone. She didn't even realize people were watching. For her, the piano was something magical, something she had dreamed of touching for years. At home, she had a small old keyboard with missing keys, and she practiced on it every day. But she had never touched a real piano like this. Her fingers hovered above the keys for a few seconds. She whispered something under her breath, maybe encouraging herself, maybe just expressing her excitement in her own quiet way. Then, with a gentle touch, she pressed one key. Just one. The sound that came out surprised her. It was fuller, richer, deeper than anything she had heard from her old keyboard. She smiled to herself, a tiny smile that only someone standing close would notice, but someone else noticed to the people sitting nearby. One of them snickered, nudging his friend. "Look," he whispered, "she thinks she can play." Another woman shook her head lightly with an amused expression. As if she were watching a child pretending to do something grown-ups did, the girl heard a bit of the laughter behind her, but she didn't turn around. She wasn't used to crowds or attention, and the last thing she ever wanted was to embarrass herself. She kept her head low, hoping no one would mind if she played just a little. She pressed another key. Then another. She wasn't doing anything special, yet just feeling the piano, adjusting to the weight of the keys and trying to understand the sound it made. More people began noticing her now. The musicians in the corner had stopped talking. One of them crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow as if preparing to say something if she continued. But he didn't want to cause a scene in front of the guests, so he simply waited, watching. The girl placed both hands on the keys now, barely letting her fingertips rest on them. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Something in her shifted. She wasn't just curious anymore, she was ready to try something she had practiced quietly at home. A small tune she knew well. Simple, but meaningful to her. She pressed the first chord with both hands. A few people turned their heads more fully this time. The sound wasn't random. It wasn't messy. Her touch, though light, had intention. Her fingers moved again, playing a few more notes, forming the beginning of something that made a couple of guests stop mid-conversation. But before she could continue, someone from the crowd let out a small laugh. A man near the back joked to the person beside him, "She's probably going to break it." More soft chuckles followed. The girl froze, her hands still on the keys. She felt a little sting in her chest, the kind that comes when you don't want to be judged, but know that people already are. She looked down at her hands and hesitated. Maybe she should stop. Maybe she had already gone too far. She didn't want the musicians to get upset, and she didn't want to attract attention. She almost pulled her hands away, but then she remembered something her guardian always told her. If you feel something in your heart, even if no one understands it, let it guide you. Don't be afraid of people who laugh. They laugh because they don't know your story. The girl inhaled slowly again, calming herself. She placed her fingers softly on the keys, and this time, she started playing the melody she had practiced quietly at home for months. Her hands trembled at first, but with each note, her confidence grew. The sound began to blend into a soft, gentle tune that filled the space around her. The laughter faded for a moment. A few people who had been giggling earlier leaned in, trying to hear better. The melody wasn't fancy or loud. It was simple and pure, but there was something in it, something emotional, something honest. The kind of sound that didn't need big gestures or grand performances to touch someone's heart. The girl had no idea that the room was slowly shifting. People who had been laughing were now listening. Others who hadn't even noticed her before were turning their heads. The musicians who had doubted her were staring at the piano, suddenly unsure of what they were witnessing. The hall was still filled with voices and movement, but something in the air had changed, something subtle but powerful. The girl didn't notice it. Her eyes were closed now, and she was lost in her own little world, letting her fingers guide her from memory. She didn't care who was watching or what they thought. In that moment, the piano wasn't just an instrument. It was a place where she felt safe, understood, and free. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just playing the way she always did, quietly, gently, from the heart, and without even realizing it, she had already taken the first step toward leaving everyone in the hall completely stunned. The girl continued sitting at the piano, her small fingers moving lightly across the keys, but she still didn't know how much attention she had already drawn. The hall, which had been full of chatter only minutes earlier, began to shift its focus toward her. Conversation slowed. People stopped moving around as much. A few guests tilted their heads, trying to figure out if what they were hearing was accidental or intentional. At first, the melody she played was soft and careful, like someone testing the coldness of water before stepping in. She pressed each key with gentle curiosity, but every note seemed to connect smoothly with the next. It wasn't a complicated tune, but it had real feeling. Something about the way she played carried a quiet story inside it. Even though she didn't say a single word, some of the younger children nearby stopped running and instead stood closer to their parents, watching her with interest. Their earlier giggles faded away as they realized she wasn't just tapping the keys randomly. A few older guests, who had been standing farther back, leaned forward slightly. There was something unusual about the moment, something that made people listen, even if they weren't sure why. The girl kept her head down, focusing on the piano. She didn't lift her eyes to look at anyone. She didn't know who was watching or who wasn't. Her whole world in that moment was the black and white keys in front of her, the smooth feel of them under her fingertips, and the soft echo her hands created with every movement. She had always played like this at home quietly, without expecting applause or praise. Her old keyboard had missing keys, and sometimes it made crackling sounds, but she never let those flaws stop her. She learned by listening to whatever music she could find. She copied sounds. She repeated melodies over and over until they stayed in her hands, not just her mind. Here, on this real piano, everything felt different. The keys felt heavier but cleaner. The sound was deeper and more beautiful than anything she was used to. And even though she was nervous at first, part of her felt strangely comfortable, almost like the piano understood her in a way people rarely did. The hall continued to grow quieter. A small group of adults who had been chatting near the snack table paused mid-sentence and turned their heads toward the stage. One of them squinted a little, confused. "Who is that girl?" she whispered to her friend. The friend shrugged, unable to hide a look of surprise. "I don't know, but she's not just playing around." Meanwhile, the musicians who owned the piano were still in one corner of the room. At first, they had been watching with mild annoyance, expecting the girl to stop after a few seconds. But now their expressions were changing. One of them tilted his head as if trying to match the melody in his mind. Another took a small step forward without realizing it, drawn in by the unexpected sound. "She shouldn't be touching the piano," one of them muttered, though his voice lacked the firmness it had earlier. He didn't sound angry anymore, just unsure. It wasn't every day that a stranger, especially a young girl, sat at their instrument and played something that made people pause. Back on the stage, the girl's confidence grew little by little. The light trembling in her fingers settled. Her hands began moving more freely, not rushing but flowing across the keys with natural rhythm. She shifted seamlessly into a slightly more complex part of the melody, still simple to trained musicians, but filled with emotion that even untrained ears could feel. A few guests sitting close to the stage exchanged glances. Their expressions softened. Some raised their eyebrows in admiration, surprised by what they were hearing. Even those who didn't understand music felt something warm pulling at their attention. The girl wasn't performing a practiced piece meant to impress anyone. She wasn't showing off. She was simply expressing something she carried inside, quiet hopes, silent wishes, and all the afternoons she spent alone playing tunes only she could hear. The music she created wasn't loud, but it was honest. And honesty, even in the form of a simple melody, has a strange way of reaching people. Someone in the back whispered, "Listen." "She's good," another person replied. "Where did she learn that?" A third guest shook their head slowly, trying to make sense of the moment. "She came in with that older lady earlier. I thought she was just waiting around." Still, not everyone was immediately impressed. A couple of guests who had chuckled earlier folded their arms and tried to look uninterested, as if they didn't want to admit they had been wrong. But their eyes gave them away. They kept glancing at the stage, unable to ignore the sound. One person, sitting near the middle of the hall, pulled out their phone and quietly recorded a few seconds. They weren't trying to make a spectacle of it. They just wanted to capture the unexpected moment. "This is unusual," they whispered under their breath. "No one's going to believe this happened at a small gathering like this." Meanwhile, the girl continued playing, unaware of the subtle changes happening all around her. She didn't see the small crowd that was forming without her permission. She didn't see the musicians inching closer. She didn't see the surprised faces or the softened expressions. All she felt was the familiar comfort of the keys beneath her hands and the sound that filled her chest like a soft, steady heartbeat. She shifted into another part of the melody that she had practiced endlessly at home. Her hands moved faster now, not too fast, but fast enough to show that she had more skill than anyone expected from a girl her age who had never had formal lessons. The notes blended smoothly, each one rolling into the next like gentle waves. More people turned their heads. A woman near the entrance, who had been busy checking her messages on her phone, suddenly looked up. Her eyes widened slightly. "Who is playing?" she whispered to the man beside her. He shrugged, just as clueless. "I don't know, but she's really good." The soft laughter from earlier had disappeared completely. The hall wasn't silent, but the energy had shifted. Instead of chatter, there was curiosity. Instead of judgment, there was interest. The air felt different, lighter in some places, heavier in others. As people tried to make sense of what they were hearing, the girl played on, shifting her hands with smooth confidence she didn't even realize she had. For her, music had always been a place where she could escape. When life felt confusing or noisy, she used melodies to express what words couldn't. She never imagined that someday she would sit in front of a real piano, playing in front of people not because she wanted attention, but because her heart naturally led her there, on the right side of the hall. A man who had once studied piano lessons long ago leaned forward, listening carefully. He whispered to his friend, "She's playing by ear." "I can tell?" His friend frowned. "How do you know?" He nodded toward the girl. "Because she makes tiny pauses in places where she's feeling the music instead of reading it. That only happens when someone learns through sound, not through sheet music." His friend looked at the girl again, now with growing respect. "She's better than half the people who take lessons." At that moment, the melody reached a point where the girl needed to switch hand positions. She hesitated for half a second, not out of fear, but to remember the shift. Then her hands moved, gliding into the next part as if she had practiced it 1,000 times. Maybe she had. Her old keyboard couldn't play some of the low notes she was using now, and she could feel the difference. Each new sound filled her with excitement. It made her want to keep going, to explore more, to see what else the piano could express for her, and the audience felt it too. Even if she didn't know they were watching, one of the musicians finally spoke softly, almost forgetting he wasn't alone. "She's not an ordinary beginner." The others nodded silently, their earlier amusement long gone. They didn't know who she was or where she came from, but they could no longer deny that something unusual was happening on their stage, back near the corner. The girl's guardian returned. They froze when they saw the scene, people gathered, eyes toward the stage, and the girl sitting at the piano like she belonged there. At first they panicked slightly, thinking she might get into trouble. But then they heard the music. Their expressions softened instantly. They stood still, watching quietly, not wanting to interrupt a moment that felt too special. The girl, completely unaware of everything around her, continued playing until the melody flowed into its final gentle notes. Her hands slowed, the tune softened, and finally she pressed the last key with a soft touch. Letting the sound fade naturally, she lifted her fingers slowly, as if afraid to break the calmness that filled the air. Her shoulders relaxed. She let out a tiny breath she hadn't realized she had been holding, and for a moment, the hall remained still. People stared at the girl in front of the piano, this quiet, shy child who had walked in unnoticed and sat on the stage as if she had no idea she was about to change the mood of the entire room. They didn't laugh now. They didn't whisper or judge. They simply waited, curious, surprised, and completely stunned by what they had just heard. For a few seconds after the girl lifted her hands from the keys, the hall stayed completely still. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty. It felt full, like everyone was trying to process what had just happened. Even the girl didn't understand the silence at first. She looked down at her hands, confused, wondering if she had done something wrong. She slowly slid off the piano bench, hoping she hadn't upset anyone. She wasn't used to being watched, and she certainly wasn't used to being the center of attention. She thought the moment was over, that she would quietly step off the stage and stand near her guardian again, but before she could move, a soft sound broke the silence. Someone near the front clapped once, then another person joined, then another. Within seconds, the hall filled with applause, not the forced, polite kind, but the kind that came from genuine surprise and admiration. The girl froze mid-step. She didn't know how to react. Her cheeks warmed, and she lowered her eyes, unsure what to do with all the attention. She had come in as a quiet, almost invisible guest. Now dozens of people were staring at her with expressions she didn't understand. Her guardian, standing near the corner, watched with pride and disbelief. They knew the girl played at home, but they had never heard her on a real piano like this. Seeing strangers moved by her music made their eyes soften even more. While the applause filled the hall, The group of musicians who owned the piano slowly approached the stage. Their earlier expressions, doubtful, amused, slightly annoyed, were gone. Now they looked thoughtful, curious, maybe even a little humbled. One of them stepped forward with a calm voice and said, "Excuse me, would you mind playing something again?" The girl looked up at them nervously. She didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure if they were upset or if they truly wanted her to continue. She had never been asked to perform before. She barely had the courage to sit down the first time, but the musician smiled softly and added, "You don't have to if you don't want to. But what you played, it touched everyone here." The girl looked at her guardian. Her guardian nodded gently, giving her reassurance. She took a small step back toward the piano bench. Unsure but willing to try again, as she sat down, a few people in the hall moved closer. Some stood along the sides, others took their seats. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, the kind that appears before something special happens. The girl placed her hands on the keys, but before she started, she paused. She wasn't sure what to play next. She hadn't prepared anything. She didn't even expect to play once, let alone twice. But she remembered a melody she had created at home, a tune she made herself during evenings, when she felt lonely and needed something to comfort her. It wasn't a famous piece. No one would recognize it, but it meant something to her. She took a quiet breath and began. This melody was different from the first one. It started soft, almost like a whisper. The notes rose and fell gently, carrying a fragile emotion through the hall. It wasn't perfect. There were tiny pauses where she gathered her thoughts, small hesitations when she had to remember where to move her hands next. But those imperfections made the moment even more real. The audience could feel her sincerity in every note. The hall, once again, shifted into near silence. People leaned forward as though they didn't want to miss even a single sound. Even the children who had been restless earlier stayed unusually still. The musicians stood a few steps behind her, watching carefully. One of them whispered, "She's playing something original." "You can hear it." Another nodded. "She feels the music. She doesn't just repeat it." The girl continued playing, her confidence growing with every moment. Her fingers moved more freely now, no longer held back by nerves. She wasn't thinking about the crowd. She wasn't thinking about who might be judging her. She was simply expressing something she carried for a long time, something she never shared with anyone. As the melody deepened, a woman sitting close to the stage felt tears forming in her eyes. She didn't know the girl, she didn't know the story, but she felt something honest in the sound, something that reminded her of childhood dreams she once held. A man beside her swallowed gently. Surprised by how emotional he felt from such a simple tune, another guest whispered, "Listen to her. She plays like she's telling a secret." Someone else replied, "It's like she's speaking through her hands." The girl's guardian watched from the corner, their hearts swelling with pride. They had always known the girl was special, but they did not expect her music to reach strangers this deeply. They saw people who had never met the girl reacting with real emotions, as if her music had touched something personal in each of them. As she played on, her melody shifted into a slightly faster rhythm. Her hands moved more quickly, dancing across the keys with surprising grace. Several guests raised their eyebrows, wondering how a child who looked so fragile could play with such confidence and control. One musician stepped closer, studying her technique. He whispered quietly, "She has no formal training. You can tell by the way she sits. But the way she listens to the piano, only real talent does that." The others nodded silently. When she reached the final part of her self-made tune, she softened her touch again, bringing the melody down slowly like the calm ending of a long story. Her fingers lingered on the last note, holding it just a moment longer before releasing it. Silence fell again, but this time, it was deeper. It wasn't the silence of confusion or surprise. It was the silence that comes right before a wave hits the shore. Then the applause burst into the air, louder than before. Fuller, warmer people clapped with enthusiasm, some even standing up. A few guests called out things like, "Well done," or "Amazing." Others simply smiled, unable to hide how impressed they were. The girl looked overwhelmed. She wasn't used to being praised, especially not by strangers. Her eyes widened slightly and she took a tiny step back from the piano, unsure what to do. She didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to applause. She wasn't used to attention of any kind, but the applause kept going. It wasn't just appreciation, it was a kind of respect she had never received before. The musician stepped onto the stage and approached her gently. The one who had spoken earlier knelt slightly so he could speak at her level. "You have something very rare," he said warmly. "Something natural." The girl blinked, unsure what he meant. Another musician added with a soft smile, "Have you ever taken lessons?" She shook her head shyly. The musicians exchanged looks of disbelief. They had seen talented children before, but not like this. Not a girl who taught herself on a broken keyboard, who walked into a hall without expecting anything, and who now had a room full of people speechless and emotional. One of them gently asked, "Would you like to learn?" "Proper lessons. Real training?" The girl's eyes widened. She didn't know how to answer. She looked at her guardian again, uncertain. Her guardian approached, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "She practices at home," they explained softly, "on an old keyboard. She never had a chance to learn properly." The musicians exchanged looks once more, their respect for the girl growing even stronger. Someone from the audience spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "She deserves a chance." Another agreed, "She's gifted. You can't deny it." Slowly, more voices joined in, not shouting, but calmly agreeing. Offering encouragement, the girl felt something she had never felt before, people believing in her, but she still stood quietly, unsure what would happen next. The musician placed a hand over his heart and said gently, "You don't have to decide today. But if you ever want to learn, we will help you." The girl nodded slowly, still overwhelmed, but grateful. She didn't understand everything happening around her. She didn't know what doors were quietly opening for her. She only knew that she had played because her heart told her to. She had no idea her simple act would leave a hall full of people, completely stunned and eager to see what she would become next. After the applause faded, the girl stepped down from the stage slowly, almost as if she wasn't sure the moment was real. She held her guardian's hand tightly, her small fingers trembling a little, not from fear, but from a rush of feelings she didn't know how to explain. She had never been surrounded by so many eyes before, especially eyes filled with warmth instead of doubt. People continued to talk about her performance as she walked quietly across the hall. Some stepped aside respectfully, giving her space. Others whispered to their friends, "That girl, where did she learn?" Or, "I've never heard someone play with such feeling." A few guests smiled at her as she passed, but she kept her gaze down. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. Her guardian bent down and whispered, "You did well." "Very well." Their voice was soft but filled with pride. The girl nodded, still trying to understand everything. She had only wanted to touch the piano, maybe try a few notes. She never imagined her simple attempt would turn into something so big. Meanwhile, the musicians gathered near the stage, discussing her quietly. Their earlier confidence, the kind that came from years of experience, had taken a new shape. They weren't threatened or bothered. Instead, they were genuinely impressed. They spoke in low voices, trying to understand how someone so young and untrained could play with such emotion. One of them finally walked toward her guardian. "If you have a moment," he said politely, "we'd like to talk." The guardian nodded, and they stepped aside to a quieter corner. The girl stood beside them, holding on to her guardian's sleeve. She felt small next to the older musicians, but she listened carefully. The musicians spoke gently. "We're serious about what we said on stage. She has something rare. Natural talent like that is unusual. If she wants proper lessons, we can arrange something." The guardian looked down at the girl, letting her decide. "Do you want to learn?" they asked softly. The girl opened her mouth but didn't know what to say. Her thoughts were a mix of excitement, uncertainty, and a dream she had kept hidden for years. She had always wanted to learn properly, but opportunities like this never came her way. She felt her heart beating faster, and she nodded slowly, shy. but sincere. A warm smile spread across the musician's face. "Then we'll help," he said. "Not just today. We want to guide her." News of this conversation spread quietly across the hall. A few people nodded approvingly, happy to see someone willing to support her. Others whispered things like, "This could change her life," or "She deserves it." But not everyone left the hall immediately. Many guests stayed longer than planned, hoping to speak to the girl or simply wanting to feel the energy of the moment a little longer. Some even approached her guardian with kind words. One woman said, "I hope she keeps playing. There's something special in her." A man added, "If she ever performs again, I want to be there." Even the children who had laughed earlier were now staring at her with wide eyes, whispering to each other about how she had surprised everyone. But the girl herself didn't feel like a star. She felt like a child who had accidentally walked into a dream. She tugged gently on her guardian's sleeve and whispered, "Can we go home now?" She wasn't tired from playing, she was tired from all the attention. Her guardian smiled and nodded. They thanked the musicians and promised to talk more soon. Before they left, one musician pressed a small card into the guardian's hand. "Call us anytime," he said. "We'll be waiting." The girl glanced back at the piano one last time before walking out. She admired its shine, its graceful shape, the feeling it had given her. For a moment, she imagined herself sitting there again someday, but with confidence, with skill, with the ability to create music that reached people's hearts even more deeply than today. When they stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapped around her like a gentle blanket. The night sky felt calm, and the stars looked brighter than usual, as if celebrating quietly with her. She breathed in deeply, finally feeling a sense of peace after the overwhelming room full of people. On the walk home, her guardian asked, "How do you feel?" The girl thought for a moment before answering, "Happy, but nervous." "That's normal," her guardian said with a warm smile. "Big moments feel like that." The girl looked up again. "Do you think I really can learn? Properly?" Her guardian placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I think you already learned so much on your own. Just imagine what you can do with help." Later that night, when they reached home, the girl sat down in front of her old keyboard. The keys were worn out, a few didn't work anymore, and some buttons made scratchy noises. But she loved it anyway. It had always been her only friend in music, the thing that kept her dreaming. She pressed a few keys, realizing how different it felt from the piano in the hall. But instead of feeling sad about it, she smiled. She felt grateful. This little keyboard had helped her discover something inside herself, something she never shared with anyone until today. Her guardian watched her from the doorway. "Will you play again?" they asked gently. The girl nodded. She placed her hands on the broken keyboard and began playing the same melody she had performed in the hall. It didn't sound as beautiful, but the feeling was the same. And that feeling was enough. In the days that followed, the story of the girl at the piano spread quietly through town. People talked about her at grocery stores, in small cafes, and even in schoolyards. Some had recorded parts of her playing on their phones and shared them with friends or family. Others simply described the moment, saying, "You should have been there." It was unbelievable. Soon, the musicians reached out again. They invited her to their studio, a small but well-kept place filled with instruments and warm lighting. When she first walked in, her eyes widened. She had never seen so many musical tools in one room. One musician said, "This is where you'll learn. Take your time, explore." The girl touched a few keys on one of the pianos gently, surprised by how soft and clean they felt. She looked around the room as if she had stepped into another world. Over the next weeks, the musicians began teaching her, not in a strict or heavy way, but gently, guiding her with patience. They never rushed her. They let her learn through sound first, the way she had always played. They showed her little things, how to place her fingers properly, how to read simple notes, how to control the weight of her hands. And each day, she grew a little more confident. They were amazed at how quickly she understood what they taught. She learned like someone who had been waiting her whole life for a chance. Her guardian watched her lessons proudly. Sometimes they sat quietly in the corner, just listening. Other times they chatted with the musicians about her progress. Everyone agreed she had a rare gift. After a few months, the musicians suggested something surprising. "We're having a small recital soon. Would you like to play one piece?" The girl froze, her heart skipping a beat. The idea of playing in front of people again scared her. The memory of the first night still felt unreal. But then she remembered the applause, the smiles, the support. She remembered how the music made her feel. After a long moment, she nodded softly. On the night of the recital, the hall looked almost the same as the first time she walked in, but this time she wasn't a stranger. People recognized her. They whispered excitedly when she entered. The musicians introduced her gently, explaining how she had trained with them and how much she had grown. The girl sat at the piano again, feeling the familiar weight of the keys. Her hands trembled a little, but she took a deep breath. She looked toward her guardian in the audience. They gave her a reassuring nod. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. This time, the melody was stronger, fuller, more confident. It carried everything she had learned, every moment she had practiced, every emotion she held inside. Her hands flowed smoothly. Her posture was steady. Her eyes stayed focused, and once again, the hall grew completely silent. People watched with admiration. Some smiled gently. Others held their breath. The girl who once touched the piano out of curiosity now played like she belonged there. When she finished, the applause rose again, loud, warm, and full of admiration. Her guardian wiped tears from their eyes. The musicians clapped proudly, and the girl, she smiled, really smiled for the first time on stage. She had gone from a quiet child with a broken keyboard to someone who touched hearts with her music. And she realized something important. She didn't need a fancy beginning to create a beautiful journey. She only needed faith, kindness, and the courage to touch the piano even when people laughed. From that moment on, she knew one thing clearly: this was only the beginning of her story.